Thank you. Hi, I'm Goldman from the National Council for Science and the Environment, and I'm thrilled to be moderating, and I've also been part of the organizing committee for this conference, and it's been a pleasure. This panel will tackle policy head-on, so informing Arctic policy. One note on change in participation. John Holdren was not able to travel and participate. Joel Clement and Fran Omer will be here in his stead. And I would like to actually just start by asking the panel to do a bit more of an extended introduction, and in doing so, kind of share a little bit about what they bring to this panel. What perspective from the policy ecosystem do you represent? So, Volker.
You want me to start?
I would love you to start.
So my name is Volker Rachold. I'm the head of the German Arctic office at the Alfred Wegener Institute for Polar Marine Research, or AWI as we call it in German. So my background is on geochemistry, so I'm an educated geochemist. And before I came into policy and science management, many years ago, I spent my summers in Siberia working on river geochemistry, on coastal processes, and subsea permafrost. So since 2.5 years, I'm heading the German Arctic office, which is an instrument of the Alfred Wegener Institute to do exactly what we are talking about, to advise German policy on Arctic issues. So as you know, the AWI, with more than 1,000 staff stations in the Arctic and Antarctic, and our icebreaker Polarstern, is probably the largest polar research institute in the world, addressing both Arctic and Antarctic issues. But of course, our mandate also includes advising the German government on our issues. And since there's so much interest now over the last years in the Arctic, we thought that having a specific instrument, so the Arctic office only dealing with the Arctic, would be very useful, and so that's what I'm working on. So I'm working with various ministries. Just to give you two quick examples, with the Foreign Office, which represents Germany on the Arctic Council as observer. So I very much support the German office in finding the right experts for the various groups of the Arctic Council. So we now have German delegates in all the Arctic Council working groups. Another example there was last year when I supported the Ministry for Education and Research in preparing the Arctic Science Ministerial in Berlin. So my office was responsible for the scientific part of the Arctic Science Ministerial that we organized together with Finland and the European Commission in Berlin last year in October.
Thank you. Fran.
Hi, my name is Fran Omer, and I have lived in Alaska for about 45 years. I've had the opportunity to travel all over the state and been blessed with the mentorship of many excellent and wonderful and heartfelt advisors like Caleb Bangawi and Edward Itta and Julie Kitka and Rosita Whirl and many others who have shared with me the rich diversity of Alaska Native culture. My career has been a mixture of government and academia, elected office, appointed office. I've worked at the state level, at the national level, and at the international level in what I would describe as the intersection of science and policy and politics. And today I'm here partially as the chair of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, but also as a person who believes very much that information can inform policy and can make a difference in the political world, but that we all together need to do a better job of finding pathways to take the should to the will to the is. And that's what I see a very important part of what we do together as we leave this conference today.
Hello, my name is Markku Ollikainen. I'm a professor of environmental economics. I'm not an Arctic researcher. I'm here in my capacity as a chair of the Finnish Climate Change Panel. This panel is set by the Climate Act of Finland, and its task is to give science-based policy advice for the Finnish government and for the ministries that are preparing climate policy. I have worked in this capacity the last 8 years. I was a science advisor of the Finnish delegation in Paris climate agreement negotiations, and I'm at the kind of service of the Prime Minister and the Ministry of Environment and Climate 24/7. For instance, just before I departed Finland to come here, I got a phone call and a night before at 10 p.m. To give an advice on a detailed issue. But anyways, that's been my role. If you are unfamiliar about these climate change panels or committees, there are now about 15 committees in Europe, in European countries. All are backed up by most are backed up by climate law. All have this task to give science-based policy. And I guess most of you are natural scientists. I'm sorry to say that if I look at the composition of these panels, climate scientists are in minority. And actually these panels are full of people who are working on climate issues, but very close to policy sciences, such as sociology, law, political science, economics, or energy policy. Because these sciences produce information, science-based information on how to make a reform in a society, how to interpret behavior of people, and how to change the behavior. So these teams produce multidisciplinary synthesis of policy issues.
Well, hi, my name's Joel Clement. I'm delighted to be here as well. I think this is the only federal building where I feel welcome, so it's good to be here. That's right. So if you came for President Obama's science advisors, hopefully you'll stick around for President Trump's first whistleblower. It's good to be here. I currently work at the Harvard Kennedy School, the Arctic Initiative there in the Belfer Center. We're delighted to have Fran on board there now. But for the past 20 years or so, I've worked in resilience, climate adaptation, and the science and policy interface. I started in the philanthropic community for a number of years, and then I was here at the Interior Department for nearly 7 years, working on Arctic issues, climate change issues, resilience issues, working quite closely with the Arctic Council partners and stakeholders, and an actually failed attempt to help get people out of harm's way in the coastal villages of Alaska. And since then, I've now landed with a great team at Harvard working on and focusing on implementing some of the things we did, particularly in the Arctic Council, the Arctic Resilience Action Framework, which was actually signed and approved by the ministers at the last ministerial, despite some other glitches. Not the last ministerial now, it's been a couple of years. It was 2017. It was the first regional resilience framework in the world, and it sets a great model. So implementing that requires doing a lot of research on existing resilience actions in the Arctic, resilience-related governance in the Arctic, and looking for opportunities. So that's some of the work we're doing at Harvard right now. Thanks.
Thanks. So I'd like to open with one question to the panel. So given that there's no such thing as sort of a monolithic policymaker, you all occupy very different spaces within the policy ecosystem. What would you say from each of your vantage points are the most acute needs that policymakers have to address the challenges of a rapidly changing Arctic?
I would say that it depends upon what level of government you're at in terms of what you most need. So if you are operating at the city or state level, I used to be a mayor, so I can relate to this, you really need things like downscaled climate models so that you can make real-world decisions in the planning and preparation process as we expect major impacts, whether it's sea level rise or whatever. If you are operating at a state level, you are much more interested in the kind of information that will drive the policy that you can move forward in a legislature or in a budget. And if you are at the national or international level, you need different kinds of information to help guide solutions. Or if you are in a response capacity, like the Coast Guard, as we heard during the scenario planning process the other day, you need a very sophisticated methodology for domain awareness and environmental information that will help guide response. So it really depends upon where you are, but I would say all policymakers need a couple of things in common. They need more awareness of how serious the problem is and how imminent the impacts are. They need more support from the public sector, citizens. They need more political support to do what is necessary in terms of action, and they need often funding and the ability to get that funding to take knowledge to action.
Yeah, maybe building on that, I fully agree with what you say, Fran. And if you look at this from, let's say, the perspective of a non-Arctic country like Germany, of course, the most interesting things for policymakers are the impacts that changes in the Arctic have, let's say, for our latitudes, for Europe and for Germany. So what's affecting us, what's happening in the Arctic? And we heard that here. I mean, this is the sea level, which is the major issue. This is, of course, changes in atmospheric circulation that produce droughts and heat waves. We had this in 2 summers now in Europe, really droughts and heat waves. It's possibly the permafrost, where we still have a couple of questions what permafrost will do. So it's, of course, it's thawing, but the amount of greenhouse gas coming from the permafrost is still a question. So maybe I can give you an example of what we do within Germany, what my office does in Germany to inform policy and to get, let's say, the policy decision makers at one table. So we have a dialogue forum which we do every half a year, where we invite all the various ministries, so 7 federal ministries in Germany, to a meeting. This is hosted by one of the ministries. And there we get, since a couple of years already, the ministries together. We inform them, we present our science, of course, we discuss their issues. We also invite other institutes, because the AVI does mainly do natural sciences, and we have other institutes in Germany that do political sciences and social sciences and other things. So, and that has been a very successful format, and the ministries, they like that, because it's organized by a scientific entity, so we are kind of a neutral broker. So they use it also for informal discussions. And I think I can even say that this was also instrumental in terms of adopting and developing the new German Arctic strategy, which was just published 2 weeks ago. So I think without this dialogue forum and the trust and relationship we built up between the ministries, that would have not worked, actually.
If I may add here, I fully agree with you on those. My experience is that policymakers do not understand how rapid this change is. And so we need more kind of preparedness to changes. The other thing is that given that the change is very rapid, we need something that what we do now and how it's robust in terms of the long-term development. So having robust policies at stake is more than important.
I would just amplify what you were saying, Markku, and also Fran. I think there are 2 main pivots that I think need to happen. But I'll preface these remarks by saying that this is an emergency. This is not a slow creeping trend like erosion, right? We've been so stunned by the things we've seen this last winter, the lack of sea ice, the events in the Bering Sea. Certainly on the US side, we've been stunned. Scientists are surprised at the rate of change. Denali was talking about the ghost fish coming over the stern. We're seeing changes quick and fast. And the thing that I think we forget is that until mid-century at least, these changes are going to accelerate, not just be bad, but they're going to accelerate. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, because we're looking right now at changes that are probably going to seem pretty quaint in about 10 years. So I do think it's important that we consider, and I will say the number one thing I think about is disaster response. There are a lot of people in harm's way, but beyond that, 2015 was a good year for global agreements around climate change. There was the Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals were signed that year, but also the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction. And it didn't get a lot of play, but this was the first global framework for addressing disaster risk in advance. And another way of talking about reducing disaster risk is building resilience. And that's something we really need to focus on in the Arctic. Obviously, I'm the guy that's going to say that because that's my thing, but I also do think we need to accelerate that and also disaster response. And I think our infrastructure, our science infrastructure and our policy infrastructure is going to need to retool for rapid response. I think it's going to start happening quick and fast. We're not going to see additional funds, certainly on the public side, coming in to solve these problems, and we're going to need to do a lot of that regionally. So I think that's the first thing that needs to change. And the second thing is the role of indigenous knowledge holders. I know we've heard quite a lot about this here, but I think if there are going to be strategies that are going to get us through the eye of this Arctic transformation needle, going forward, they shouldn't just include Indigenous knowledge holders, they should be led by Indigenous knowledge holders. And I say that not because the Indigenous people of the North have lived through millennia of change and experienced this kind of change, because they haven't. No humans have experienced the kind of change we're experiencing now and will experience, but it's because they have the broadest and deepest understanding of place and change and time on Earth right now. And I think that for that reason, that they need to be in the leadership position for all of this. And so again, our policy and our science infrastructures, I think, need to pivot around that important need.
Thanks. So we heard, Volker, you gave a good example of an emerging science infrastructure and infrastructure for scientific input into government decision-making that is effective and has grown over the past couple of years. Fran, we heard this articulation of what we think decision makers will need at different scales of decision. I'd like to hear a little bit more from the panel about, well, what are some of the on-ramps, if you will. So what are sort of the implementation on-ramps or pathways that we might think of that we're not thinking of right now in terms of getting the input that we need into decision-making processes in the timeframes that we need it. So we don't often think about the university community with rapid response capabilities, but we're in a disaster situation. So maybe you could comment. I don't know who wants to take that.
I can start.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I just want to build on what Joel said on the emergency. I mean, this is absolutely true. And you probably saw that the new IPCC report on cryosphere and ocean leaked, and that was the first information in the media. And this is shocking, alarming, actually. And this sea level rise is really a major issue. And I think in the leak report, they talk about 250 million refugees only from sea level. And this is an emergency. This is by the end of the century, of course. So I think there is a need for and this message hasn't got across, you're right. I think it's not really understood in the political system, I think. And I think I would call, especially for the Arctic countries and for the Arctic Council. So yesterday morning when I woke up at 3 or something like that, so I did a little exercise and calculated how much CO2 comes from the Arctic countries. It's about 20%. And how much CO2 comes from the Arctic countries plus observer countries. And it's more than 70%. So, and of course, the Arctic countries are the countries that are seeing the impact in their own land. Yeah? And I think it should be their responsibility also to do something on a global level in terms of our climate negotiations. And having the observers on board, they account for 70% of the CO2. Yeah? And this is also, I think, for the observers, a meaningful way of getting more involved in the Arctic Council. So I would really hope that the Arctic Council, which is, in my view, a very successful body, so they did fantastic things with their assessments. ASEA is a milestone. ASEA was published in 2005 together with IASC. But I think in terms of the CO2, this is not really on the agenda of the Arctic Council so far.
I may continue. Of course, the mitigation is the number one. If we can keep the increase in global temperature below or at 1.2 degrees, then we know, for instance, that we have the Arctic or North Sea. Arctic Sea is free of ice once in 100 years. But if we go to 2 or above, it's every 10 years. So the difference is huge. And without good or global mitigation effort, we don't cope with this thing. But I'm not the specialist in adaptation, but I would like to mention the thing that actually Arctic policies are at place in a way which I don't like so much. There are lots of countries, there are a lot of companies that are planning and already doing kind of utilization of the resources that we get out from from Greenland or from by oil drilling and things like that. Actually, countries do decisions already that facilitate this type of development, which makes things worse. So we need also to correct the policies that we have nowadays. We start to build up, let's say, international agreement that prevent spoiling the Arctic environment. We need to tie the hands of those coming outside the Arctic area to utilize these things. So there's lots of things that we need to do which go beyond the adaptation itself. Lots of international policy issues are at stake now.
One other on-ramp that is worth thinking about, and it's only just occurred to me that as we do start to orient around the disaster framework a little bit, or at least preventing disaster, the legislation and regulations in the U.S. that govern how we respond to disaster, the Stafford Act for how when FEMA comes and how the money flows and so on, how we fund disasters, that's all going to need to change. And even the appropriations process, when we're still struggling to get money to Puerto Rico now for political reasons. And I think because that is so focused on understanding and predicting events and both the scale and the impact of these events, there's going to need to be a lot of scientific and expert input into that process. It's going to be a fraught process, but clearly we don't have the money to keep doing it the way we do it now. So hopefully there's an opportunity there for scientists and institutions to plug directly into a reform process for that kind of legislation.
So that connects to a couple questions that have come in from the audience. What can we do from the perspective of increasing nimble, adaptive policy frameworks to accommodate the urgency of change that we're experiencing? And then to Markku's point, what more, you said that policymakers aren't really aware of just how urgent and time sensitive the changes we're seeing are. So what would you say to the communities that are experiencing these changes firsthand that are trying to reach decision makers with that sense of urgency?
Well, I'll just note that at least in the United States of America, there's quite a difference from state to state, even from city to city, in terms of not only awareness of how serious the problem is, but also political willingness to do something about it, either in mitigation or in adaptation. So it's a little hard to just generalize. And of course, I'm always struck when I go to Arctic meetings, how much of the rest of the world gets it in a way that some of the people back home in the United States don't, which always is troubling to me. But the reality is there are some places, and in California, we've heard an example even here at this conference of proactive, forward-leaning efforts at the city, county, or state level to not only acknowledge the problem, but to do some of the planning necessary. That's why I referenced the downscaling models for climate as an example, because we do have some tools that we could make it easier for those that want to lead in this space. Unfortunately, at the federal level, we are not seeing the kind of leadership that we would hope for in our country that would not only support, but also encourage more of that kind of adaptation leadership. So at this point in time, I think we have to do what we can to support those jurisdictions that are moving forward, and particularly the science community, perhaps to make a special effort to help those regions to use them as good case examples of getting ahead of the problem and putting to work the science that is known in very practical ways. And for those parts of our country, and maybe even other parts of the world, not Europe, but many other places, where there is still a dragging of feet, I think economics comes into the play. I think the case that needs to be made about how it really saves money to get ahead of a problem as opposed to waiting for the disasters to happen. And working with the insurance industry, for example. The insurance industry is a key player in this, if you ask me, because they obviously are not in business to lose money. And to the extent that the insurance industry works with governments to set standards, to make it clear that doing things ahead of time makes a lot more sense than cleaning up the mess after these disasters. It's what's in the economic best interests of both the private sector and the public sector. So that's sort of both short-term and long-term. There are a lot of strategies that have to be used in the policy sector, given that not everyone embraces the realities that most people in this room share as reality, unfortunately. But that brings us back pretty quickly to the importance of changing our game plan when it comes to communication. It's not just what we know. It's how we communicate that in a way that precipitates action. And there needs to be a lot more dialogue about that than we've had time to do at this conference, I'm afraid. But it's not so much that we don't want to. We haven't just talked about how to do that. Ole was talking a little bit about simplifying the messaging, which in this day and age is what we have to do.
A couple things come to mind about how to be more nimble. First off, of course, we need to get fossil fuel money out of the way of decision making. I think we all know that that is a huge barrier, and it's not a scientific barrier, it's a political and economic problem that absolutely has to be addressed. And government, certainly the federal government where I worked, is not known for nimble by any stretch. But there are some things that could be done. And so I think it was Corey earlier this morning mentioned the need for a whole of government approach. There's a lot of redundancy. There are at least 22 federal agencies involved in the Arctic region in the US. And trying to get them on the same page about anything is incredibly difficult. Just trying to get them on the same phone call is incredibly difficult. So there are whole of government approaches or representative approaches that where there could be delegation of authority and things that might allow a more rapid response to some of these things. Another tool that I think is underutilized, but maybe it's been utilized and failed, but theoretically scenario planning I think offers a lot of opportunities. We've heard a lot this week about the wide error bars around scientific information and how that's hard for policymakers to work with, but that's why scenario planning was devised. You plan toward one scenario, but you have contingencies for other scenarios as more information, more specific information becomes available. So you can set the policy in motion and you have contingencies in place for when that information does become better, or we get downscaled models or things like that. So I do think we could better utilize things like that, but we're a little stuck in our rigid approaches, certainly within the federal bureaucracy, but also at the state level, I think.
That is a very good point. I think that we could learn something from IPCC. They have developed an approach where they make a synthesis of the large set of literature. They indicate the certainty of the knowledge. They indicate the ranges of uncertainty, and they are able to communicate then what is let's say the key message of science. And besides, they do it by combining all branches of sciences. So then the message is much more easier for politicians to understand, and we can say that, okay, this we know for certainty, this is quite certain, this is uncertain. So this kind of classification makes much more easier to communicate, for instance, what happens in terms of climate.
I might just add one thing in terms of existing structures that help in this regard, in addition to what you just mentioned. Within the federal government, in our country at least, we have something called the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, which among friends is known as IARPC. Sorry for the code name here, but IARPC is really a tool for all of the federal agencies that have some responsibilities in federal Arctic research to communicate together and to develop a consolidated 5-year Arctic research plan for federal agency spending. That is an example of something that could be built on, because even though IARPC is largely something that federal agencies use, they've expanded it to include anyone who wishes to join the collaboration teams, which is a great way of sharing information about what Arctic research is actually being done, is planned to be done, and what some of the results are. So for those of you who aren't already part of a collaboration team under IARPC, you might actually just want to Google that and join it, because it is an example of not how you get a decision made, but how you can make sure that the people who are in the agencies who are responsible for certain federal agency authorities within the Arctic, how they are moving forward in their research agendas, and also how you as a non-federal person can link into that. I think that must mean I should stop. I'll stop.
I want to ask one more question. So lots of great questions coming in, and I know we're not going to get to them all, but I did want to follow up. In this panel, we mentioned the role, Fran, I think you brought up the role of the insurance industry, and the comment was made here is throughout the conference, we've heard relatively little about the role of the private sector in driving policy change, and I'm wondering if each of you could comment on where you see the private sector fitting in different ways.
Well, I'll just say, this is unrealistic and probably not something you want to have happen, but Google could move a village out of harm's way in Alaska in a heartbeat, right? That wouldn't go well. It's not driven by the community. That doesn't sound great, right? But the dollars that are in the private sector that could be applied here are immense. And one of the things that we're working on at Harvard is trying to understand the cash flows in the Arctic to see if there are these they may be minuscule, but opportunities to encourage private investment on resilience projects because there may be a minuscule return on investment. So seeking out, if anyone here has any understanding of these fiscal instruments that I know little about, we're very open to finding out where there has been some demonstration of a return on investment on very small things, because once you crack that door open for actual investment from the private sector, there are billions of dollars waiting to be moved into some return. So it's important.
I think working with the private sector is sometimes more rewarding than working with politics. So, because these are people who can do something and who will do something. So, for example, I had a great experience. I was in Greenland in May with a tour of the young global leaders of the World Economic Forum. So it was a guided tour for 25 young global leaders, awesome people from 20 countries in the world. Young entrepreneurs, but also young politicians, professional soccer player, artists, and various kind of people. And so we were showing them climate change in Greenland. So giving lectures, and we flew to the glacier. Everything, of course, was CO2 compensated, so it was climate neutral and absolutely perfectly organized. And they all, after that, they saw that, they got back home and said, I need to do something. And I'm still on their mailing list and group and see what's happening. So they all do whatever they can. Within their company, whatever they run. So I think this is a very rewarding thing to do.
I try not to be cynical, but my understanding is that very much depends on what sort of policies we have in. There are lots of businesses and companies who are kind of designed to produce environmentally friendly processes, products, things like that. But to support those, we need policies. And if the policies are at place, then we can rely on the initiatives that the business can provide. But business as such, it very much depends on what they are doing. That doesn't guarantee anything. But once we have policies in, then we get let's say, a flow of good solutions and suggestions and businesses.
The only thing I would add is last year I went to the California Climate Summit, which was called by Governor Brown. And there were many, many announcements made at that summit by businesses that were really taking steps forward in terms of their own company operations, in terms of reducing their carbon footprint, in terms of trying to really set a high standard, not only for their own employees, but also for their peers. And I think there is leadership in the private sector, but I agree with you. Most businesses are in business to make money. And so the incentive systems, the subsidy systems, the rules like carbon taxes, all of those come together in a way that really send the signals that will either help or not help us make progress as a society.
This is a question that's very near and dear to my heart. So policy can be really impenetrable. And for someone who really wants to understand how to make a difference, what recommendations, what advice would you give to young people who want to have a role in influencing policy in the future, but don't know where to get started?
I got something for that. I'm always looking for this opportunity when I give talks because, and I speak at universities quite a lot, so I usually get this question. When we're sitting, if Erica's leading a meeting at CQ about some executive order or something that's likely to come out of the White House, we all, the people from each of the agencies are around the table and word goes out, okay, we need scientific input on this, we need indigenous knowledge input on this. We reach out into the agencies first. Some people have their own networks of experts that they can tap into outside of government, but for the most part, the first place you go is either within your own agency or approximate agency. Everyone in this room needs to consider working in federal service. And I know it's ironic coming from me, but things will change hopefully soon. And there are so many opportunities for scientists, indigenous knowledge holders, and early career people just coming in, just graduating from college to get into these agencies now. There's going to be a huge reboot of the federal science enterprise. It's already underway. I think the Department of the Interior, which is 70,000 employees, I think within the next 5 years, over 50% of those people are retirement eligible. So the agency's going to bottom out. We'll lose a lot of institutional knowledge, no doubt, but there's also an opportunity to bring in and invigorate with all the new kinds of thinking. People who don't even question the importance of addressing climate change or don't question the importance of diversity in the workplace and all these important ideas that can really reinvigorate the federal enterprise. So my answer is always, please consider public service, because I think it's something that we need to make it sexy again, because it's been denigrated for so long, intentionally so, by those who are trying to shrink government. And I think we need to really reinvigorate that. So I always hope to send that message.
And if not the federal government, how about the city or the state government? Go work at Austin. You know, they've got a climate change program. Go work in one of the states or counties where they really have prioritized moving forward as opposed to standing still. And there is the entire nonprofit sector. I'm on the board of the Nature Conservancy. You know, organizations like the Nature Conservancy are hungry for smart, talented, energetic, committed, inspired young people who really want to make a difference in the world. Universities need your energy as well. You know, there's a huge transformation. I spent a decade in academia, and it was just during that period of time, it was interesting how many universities have put much more emphasis on multidisciplinary work, on problem-solving kind of research, and of trying to build partnerships with communities, with indigenous people, to make sure that young people are learning the process in the university to really apply their knowledge. I know still not enough, don't get me wrong, but I think there are a lot of opportunities where you can take your passion and your expertise and make a difference.
I find it very amazing how influential and these young people can be. I mean, take Greta and the kids in the streets. So, I mean, we are working on IPCC and we're producing our reports, the best scientists, fantastic reports, and governments just say, fine, thank you, right? So, and then the kids are on the street, and I can tell you what happened in Germany. In Germany, it's a big movement there, and suddenly the Green Party, which normally had something like 10%, went up to 30%, 1/3. Yeah? And if you take young people, younger than 25, 90% of them were voting for the Green Party. And so, and the impact on our government was that we now have a climate cabinet, so it's chaired by our chancellor, and then the ministers of all the various ministries that have something to do with climate. So, and they are now working over the summer on a plan for Germany's climate strategy over the next decade. Yeah? And in my view, this is the result of the kids being on the street and not us scientists telling them what's happening. And this is pretty amazing, I think.
So shifting gears, I'm going to ask I think we'll have time for 2 or 3 more questions, but the next one, this came through the Slido. What would you each, given that you each have a different perspective on Arctic policymaking, what would you identify as the biggest challenge, or as written here, the closet alligator for Arctic policymaking? The closet alligator. What's hiding in the closet? What's the hardest challenge that if you were going to pick one?
Well, I'll just say, as a longtime Alaskan, how frustrating it is to find so few people in the lower 48, that's what we call y'all, who don't really know very much about the Arctic, don't care very much about the Arctic, and, you know, for whom these issues seem so remote, so removed, so unrelated to your lives or what matters to you. It's, you know, we don't think of ourselves as an Arctic nation. The United States doesn't. I know Canada does. I know Norway does. I know many of the 8 Arctic nations, yes, they think of themselves as an Arctic nation, and so they're willing to put resources, they're willing to put effort into the necessary things that make life in the North very livable and invest in a way that really makes a difference. It's a hard slog to get the federal government to pay much attention to Alaska and to pay much attention to the Arctic. That has gotten better. It has gotten better, I would say, in the last 5 to 10 years. starting with the rather vigorous attention that the Obama administration placed in coming up with an Arctic policy, Arctic Executive Steering Committee, the first Arctic Science Ministerial, on and on and on. That raised the attention level, but it still hasn't raised the appropriation level to go for things like additional icebreakers, additional preparation for potential oil spill, and many of the other things that you already heard about over the last 2.5 days. So big frustration, alligator in the closet, lack of attention, lack of understanding of how important this region is, lack of appreciation for the complexities of the Alaska Native cultural challenges associated, for example, with the village relocations that you've already heard about. So that's a big problem. And that lack of attention, lack of knowledge, lack of caring by Congress largely, but by others as well, is a big impediment in terms of making progress, in terms of getting investment necessary, in terms of continuing the kind of investment that NSF and others have already stepped up in recent years. That's a big challenge. And within the federal government, the big challenge of having so many of the decisions and so many of the responsibilities and so many of the programs dispersed and disconnected. And even if there are things like IARPC that try to knit things together, it's still pretty dispersed, as you've heard again from others. So getting to a whole of government approach, like we heard first thing this morning in Canada, with the very successful and encouraging and uplifting story we heard about the working together to get such a great result, that would be much harder to do in the United States.
I heard 2 alligators, right? The getting on the radar and facilitating a whole government approach.
Yep.
Others?
Well, I'll be specific then, because there are a couple of big ones, like just funding in general. You just say the word. But specifically, and this has also come up a couple times here, but we don't have a blueprint. This seems as though it should be easy, but it's very complicated. We don't have a blueprint for moving a village in a culturally appropriate, ecologically, economically appropriate way. It's been done in all the wrong ways in the past. I don't know if there are any instances out there of it being done well. But we're going to have to do it rapid fire, and until there's some sort of relocation framework or guidelines or a blueprint, it's going to be done wrong, and that's going to affect cultures. And each one of these villages is a distinct culture and tribe in the U.S., and we need to pay close attention to that. So that's what keeps me up at night, particularly in the fall when the storms are coming in, and we don't know if suddenly that we're going to need to do that. There could be loss of life, but also there could be loss of language and culture, and that's a horrifying thought. We don't have a lot left. We need to keep what we've got.
If I look at the Nordic countries, I think that things are slightly different. We have a tension in each country, Norway, Finland, Sweden, that is related to Sami people and their rights, but we are not encountering the, let's say, the disaster at the level that you are having here in Alaska. But our worries are related to international issues, how the ice sea is utilized over time, what happens in Russia, in the northern part of Russia, to people in there, and actually we don't know so much about it.
A very different point. So what I find really frustrating is that there is I would say, a handful of climate change criterions, and that they always manage to get it in the media somehow. There was a very interesting paper in Nature just published last month when they analyzed a number of studies by climate change scientists, and a number of studies, the same number of studies by climate change criterions, and they found out that the criterions made it 50% more into the media than the climate change scientists. Speaking about the new media, not the mainstream media, but the new media, so internet media. And of course, just putting out this message that there is no consensus in the scientific community, only that point, if people hear that, the public hears there is no consensus, I mean, then of course we lost, right? And that's exactly what's happening, and I find that very frustrating.
So I want to wrap the panel up on a positive note, and we're trying to give you the chance to think blue sky for a minute. Each of you has a chance to make one change, and only one change right now, either in an existing policy institution or at the science policy interface. What would it be and why? and don't think too fast and go quickly. Joel, you're first.
Okay, how about, this is good. How about the National Indigenous Knowledge Act? Gets passed, requiring there should be an Indigenous knowledge statement in every policy and regulation that's finalized in the U.S. as required by the NICA.
Okay, I would like to establish an IPCC type of body for Arctic issues.
The U.S. defense budget is about $700 billion. I would like annually 1/10 of that defense budget to go toward the preparation for the adaptation that is going to be required in the United States of America as a result of climate change.
A different point again. So I thought about that. And now one thing that I very often hear from scientists when we want them to engage in science policy dialogue, they just tell me I have no time to do it. I have to write a science paper or a nature paper. Because there's simply no mechanism of rewarding those kind of activities that scientists do, in many cases just voluntarily. So, and I think there must be a change in the system that those kind of work that scientists, in my view, should do and have to do, it's part of their job, is also rewarded, and not just the paper that they write and that is in peer-reviewed journals. So I think that would be something that would be very helpful.
Thank you. Well, with that, I'd like to thank the panel and maybe transition this blue sky thinking into the next panel and welcome our moderator of the next panel, who is also a participant on this panel, Fran, to welcome your panel up. And just to thank, round of applause for our policy panel.
As always, nice to see you.
Pleasure, Markku. Good to meet you.
Good to see you, Volker.